Thank you both for your insights and for that discussion. Up next, we have another fireside chat with a dynamic duo discussing the future outlook for AMR and key initiatives thus far in 2020. Let me introduce again Professor Dame Sally Davies, UK Government Special Envoy on AMR, who will be moderating this discussion.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And you can tell that I'm sat in Trinity College in Cambridge, not only by the sun in my study, but actually by the noise of students outside, of course, all masked and socially distanced, and our wonderful chimes of the clock. But it's my pleasure to be here at the World AMR Congress 2020 with my colleague, sparring partner and friend, Thomas Cueni. Now I frame it that way because we've sat around so many tables together, debating, challenging and arguing with each other. But I truly believe that though we may disagree about detail, we both want the same. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Thomas Cueni, the Director of IFPMA, for the next 30 minutes as my guest. Thomas, I want you to introduce yourself with all your different titles, but they do include antimicrobial resistance, AMR, which is the subject of today's talk, and this Congress. And we're going to talk particularly about innovation, and collaboration, and being us, probably a bit about challenge. How can we change the game on AMR? So Thomas, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Sally. It's such a pleasure. Of course, it would be an even bigger pleasure if we could really have a fireside chat and not do this virtually. But it's a pleasure and honor to talk to you. My name is Thomas Cueni. I'm Director General of IFPMA. And as you have heard with the acronym, IFPMA is not selling any consumer products. We are the world's pharmaceutical trade association. We have 37 big multinational pharma companies among our membership and 50 plus associations. As such, AMR, since I came to Geneva to take over the leadership of IFPMA, has been high up on my agenda. But I'm wearing a number of hats because I'm also, since 2017, the chair of the board of the AMR Industry Alliance, where you do have big pharma, biotech, diagnostic, and generic companies on AMR. And last but not least, I'm sort of the instigator of the AMR Action Fund, because the AMR Action Fund has been my brainchild, and it was probably, if I once retire, I must say it was probably the proudest moment of my 30 plus years in the industry that we were able to convince industry leaders to put up almost $1 billion for research into novel antibiotics.
So we'll come back to the AMR Action Fund, which is terribly important, but for this Congress, where they don't really know all the things you've been doing from pharma and biotech, would you like to give us a quick summary, well, a summary anyway, of all the collaborative and other work you've done?
Now, in terms of collaborations, I've been a journalist and diplomat in my past life, but actually over the last 30 years, I've been actively involved in industry trade association work, running the Swiss one, but since the Swiss in pharma are playing a rather key role, I've also been secretary of a global pharma leader CEO roundtable. And in that context, I've engaged in work of the European Trade Association. I've engaged in OECD. I'm also chair of the OECD Business at OECD Health Committee. And I think in terms of collaborations beyond AMR, we launched a couple of years ago something called Patent Informed, which is quite remarkable because pharma companies are extremely strong about protecting IP. Patent Informed actually created transparency. It makes life easier for procurement agencies. It is a joint venture we do with WIPO. We have launched Access Accelerated, which aims to bring medicines faster and better to people in developing countries. And actually, IFPMA has also been involved, and there we come to the AMR field, in the launch of the Davos Declaration. This goes back to 2017. A few months later, when the UN had their high-level meeting on AMR, the roadmap was much more precise in terms of the importance of environment, which means the discharge of antibiotics into the environment, stewardship, appropriate use of antibiotics, access to antibiotics, and last but not least, the need to get new antibiotics, which means research and development. And that led to the creation of the AMR Industry Alliance, where every 2 years we challenge each other to test whether we made progress. And when I look at it, we did make progress certainly on manufacturing discharge targets, because the environment and manufacturing quality does play an important role. I think it's quite amazing that the number of companies moved to reward their medical representatives for educating doctors how to appropriately use antibiotics rather than to maximizing sales. And also companies are committed to ensuring access even while antibiotics are still in the pipeline. And I think probably the biggest failure, at least from Big Pharma, is we have seen a further reduction of research into novel antibiotics from Big Pharma at the same time where we do have a flourishing pipeline of biotech companies, of diagnostic companies. But in terms of Big Pharma, we have seen actually Big Pharma companies exiting the field, and we haven't seen Big Pharma companies entering the field of antibiotics.
I'm always surprised about that. I know you've heard me on this before, but when investors look at companies they're investing in, they look at their lines, their product lines, and what are they doing to innovate, to keep at the top of the game and to protect those lines. So if, as I understand, new cancer drugs and old cancer drugs are one of the most profitable around, why is it that companies don't want to protect those by making available new antibiotics to protect people who will inevitably get infections? The whole health system is threatened as antimicrobial resistance builds up. I mean, I failed to get this over, but economically, I think they're being very short term. What do you think?
It's a bit of a question of moral hazard or free rider. You know, if you need to convince your shareholders to invest in antibiotic research, truth of the matter with the market, the innovation ecosystem for antibiotics is the worst which could happen to you is you succeed with the novel antibiotic research, rather than you just have to write off your investment in R&D. And we have seen this in the biotech field when you look at the failure of the sad failure of Gamechanging. They did make it to the market, but I think in 18 months, their sales were less than $2 million. And their CEO, when he filed for Chapter 11, had to admit, in order to stay alive, we would have needed $400 million for the next 10 years. Therefore, truth of the matter is that there is, of course, a really attractive market for immuno-oncology, even when you look at, for example, the high risk of dementia research. And it is an example which I use quite often. You have a 99.7% chance of failure when you launch a project into an Alzheimer drug. A 99.7% chance of failure, but you still have billions of dollars invested in dementia research, because if you do hit the target, if you do have the good luck and skill set that your product will make it to the market, you deserve a rich reward. Whereas in the antibiotic field, if you do hit it, you will lose more money than if you never get involved. And that is not that easy to explain to the venture capital, to your shareholders, to others. Therefore, although, of course, I violently agree with you that there is this broader public good and we need to make sure that we do get novel antibiotics. At the same time, if the market economies don't change, it would be hard. That's why I think it was a tough act to convince a big pharma to come up with an initiative where nobody expects to make money, at least not in the short term.
So the reasons you give are why we, our British government, with fair access to medicines, and of course the UN responsible investment people, launched the Investor Action for AMR, because these are, antibiotics are global public goods, and we all have to contribute, would be my view. But perhaps now's the moment you do explain the AMR Action Fund, what it is, and then I want you to tell us why the industry did make the move.
When you look at it, I think it is a pretty unique initiative. As I mentioned, I've been around for many years in the industry, and I do not recall any other collective initiative where 20+ companies put together $1 billion to invest in something where, as I said, right now there's no money to be made. And I think one of the reasons why we saw the movement, we saw this initiative, is that the industry has been criticized by you, but also by Jim O'Neill and others, for exiting the field, for not understanding the public health expectation. At the same time, we also noticed we have had many G20 or G7 and interagency coordination group of the UN, where you were the champion of AMR. We have seen all these meetings pondering on the O'Neill report. The World Bank has come out with reports, the OECD. We have seen statements, and Jim O'Neill once criticized me at the call to action which the UK government organized in Berlin in 2017, and said, for God's sake, why aren't you just getting your act together and invest? Because everybody agrees with $1 billion check for a market entry reward. And I had to remind him that signing a G20 declaration or G7 is not quite the same as signing $1 billion check or a $2 billion check. And I think we from the industry, we realized that if you really just continue to moan and groan about the lack of movement from governments, we are not getting anywhere. And we will be criticized for inaction. And if we are serious about moving the needle, about the need for game changer, the industry probably should be the first mover, should step up and show that we are serious about our, public health responsibility, social responsibility. Similar, and when we started the debate in April last year, we were both at the Chatham House Roundtable on AMR at that time, where we got the grim description of the market by the likes of Kevin Outterson, John Rex and others. This led to a debate within the industry, and we realized if we really want to make a change, we need to step in and step up. And at the same time, very openly and transparently indicate that this would not work unless we see policy change in sequence or in parallel. And the gist of the AMR Action Fund is, what we noticed is that there has been much more promise in discovery and early development. We have seen from AB Drive, from the Fleming Fund, from CARB-X, there has been development in early antibiotic research, but then there is what we call the valley of death. Venture capital following Archaeogen pretty much left the field, exited. none of the big pharma companies would be interested to step in and invest in the biotech companies, since, as I said, when the market is as it is, you lose more money if you invest than if you don't invest. But therefore, what could be done, and that's where the Action Fund will really engage, is provide a bridging fund, bring hopefully 2 to 4 novel antibiotics responding to public health needs to market approval within the next, hopefully, 10 years, based on WHO and CDC priority list of pathogens, which means really focusing on public health needs, and hopefully give us time and gain us time to drive policy change and to get politicians acknowledge that the industry did step up. And I must say, of course, I have great respect and I admire the UK leadership over the last few years, not least by you. And the UK pilot is a very promising first step, but I think we all know this will not suffice to change the game as we need to do.
Yeah, so yes, I agree. We need to show our pilot works, but then we need other countries to do their thing. So I'm very excited about the Pasteur Act going back into the House. So our audience are going to know what level are the funds and who's going to get them, because they're going to want to send you all their proposals, aren't they? So tell me how it's going to go forward.
One of the important elements, and it was one of the challenges early on, I had colleagues from company X, Y, or Z, I better not mention the company names, who said and told me, why the hell should we cross-subsidize the development of the other company? And why, companies still in antibiotic research saying, why should we invest more? Because we're already in there. You should go to those who are not. And that, there are all these sort of challenges, but I mentioned them because one thing is clear, the fund will not cross-subsidize research from big pharma. The fund will not invest in big pharma companies, but it's really looking in assets from small biotech companies. Some of them may have benefited from CARB-X or others, some of them not. And the fund will invest into phase 2 and then later phase 3 development, which means we don't want it to overlap with what CARB-X and others are doing. And it is one of the important elements, and I learned this from, among others, you, it is not just about money. Because if it were just about money, you could have do what Jim O'Neill at one time in frustration said, Plan B, nationalize antibiotic research. But honestly, I always thought that would be the wrong response for 2 reasons. Governments don't have a really strong track record in spending money wisely and efficiently. Big pharma, in terms of investing in the risky research and then making sure that you do have a return on investment, are rather better. Therefore, it's not just about the money, it's also, as an engaged owner, the fund should provide some skill sets and give support to the biotech companies in terms of development skills and discipline, in terms of ability, for example, to stop a project and say, let's write off the investment rather than continue and lose more money. In terms of regulatory, one of the challenges is if you get your protocol for the clinical trial wrong, you might already be much too narrow for your label, and therefore you will never make it in the market. In terms of formulation and the scalability of your product. Therefore, the skill sets which you normally find really in big pharma, and last but not least, maybe some of the big pharma companies are quite proficient in talking to hospitals or reimbursement agencies, how to get proper value for what you bring to the market. I think that's why it's not just about a venture fund. The notion is engaged owner fund. And I can tell you, we spend probably almost half of our time in the early stages on making sure that we had very strict conflict of interest rules, This is not, where the investors, which means the Pfizer's, MSDs, GSK and others, would make sure that they do not get competition or they would benefit from it. The fund will be set up through an independent management, similar to a normal venture fund. Will have a world-class, so I hope, scientific advisory board, and the investors who sit on the board, they will set the overall strategy, but not meddling to the individual investment decisions.
Good, that sounds excellent. And when do you think you'll start giving people money?
I was told quite some months ago, don't rush it, because the analysis, be it WHO or others, is there isn't that much, and awfully sorry for some in the audience to say, there isn't that much in the pipeline, the late stage pipeline. Therefore, do focus rather on things which are coming up for entering clinical trials, and be careful to be choosy about what you do. But I would expect that we will see the first investment decisions next year and in 21, and then maybe the peak in 24, 5 or 6. But also it's interesting in terms of the evolution of discussion of the fund. Initially, the talk was about a 5-year, duration of the fund, and either you have the policy change or not after 5 years, and then we'll fold it. When you look at now how it is set up, the aim is for a 10 to 15 years, because if it is not for, infinity, because unless we really get policy change, we are really interested to bring these assets to the market by 2030, and also show the patients needed to allow them to thrive, because the chances that the investors will get the money back are somewhat higher if you do show patients.
Fantastic. So you heard it here, folks. It isn't 5 years. I always argued, and I know that governments need to come in. So this isn't trying to get governments off the hook, but 5 years would be too short. Yes, we're going to need to do more. So do you think then we could say that 2020 is going to be a game-changing year for AMR, or are we going to have to look forward and just pray?
Now, as you know, I was born an optimist. Therefore, I do hope that it will be a game-changing year, but the future will show. I believe that we do have a chance. We did have an animated debate among, industry leaders whether we shouldn't wait until post-COVID-19 to launch and announce the fund. And my argument, among others, was not at all. Actually, COVID-19 was a wake-up call for the world, because the pandemic hit us and many countries pretty ill-prepared. And when we look at, we are still suffering from the huge health and economic impact. Therefore, AMR is something we know has been with us. The O'Neill report was published in 2016. We have seen all the World Bank, Jim O'Neill's and OECD data. Therefore, Kevin Outterson once said, this is not a tsunami, like SARS-CoV-2. This is like a melting glacier where the doom is on you. And we know what needs to be done. We know that we need to get the act together in terms of appropriate use, but also the research. And, to paraphrase what the OECD did a couple of years ago in the report, stemming the tide just a few dollars more. Therefore, I hear now quite often from Seth Barkley, from Gavi, the huge benefit, for example, of the Gavi childhood immunization, when you get, I think it's more than $57 return per dollar invested. When I look at actually COVID-19 right now, the world's economy is losing $375 billion per month based on IMF analysis. And when I look at the impact of AMR, it is about just a few dollars more to stem the tide, but we do need incentives and we need to recreate the market. And I think there are various ways and means. And there, to be honest, Sally, I hope we don't have to wait for 10 years. There, I really hope that we will see change in the next 3 to 5 years, because if you don't see change in the next 3 to 5 years, I'm not sure that 2020 would have been the game changer, which I think you and I hope it is.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, there are two things going on, aren't there? One is we know more people die of lack of access to antibiotics at the moment, and we all need to work on that. But another is that while people are facing the here and now of COVID, how do we keep their eye on AMR and sort some of these things? I mean, G20 was hoping to achieve quite a lot. Germany led the way. Where are we with that, do you think?
Now, my feeling and the response we got when we launched the AMR Action Fund, you were part of our launch event with Jens Spahn, German Minister of Health, the French Minister of Industry, Agnès Pannier-Runacher, the EU Health Commissioner. My sense was that actually COVID-19 helped to, as a wake-up call, that AMR is something, one could do something about it. But the question is, you really need to walk the talk. And there I may throw a question at you, as former co-convener of the ISCG. How optimistic are you? And whom do you see, apart from the UK, as leading the world? Because I do not expect that the UN will, or even G20 will really, come to the fore. Whom do you see as joining UK and really signing the billion-dollar checks or whatever we need?
Well, I'm hoping the whole world will. Let me start with that, because I think COVID has shown that what a pandemic can do. And what I've been talking about is the metaphor of the lobster dropped into boiling water that's making a big noise. And that is the pandemic of COVID-19. But we also have this slow growing pandemic, which is going to kill more people of AMR, which is like the lobster put into cold water being heated up. We all have an interest in this. And interestingly, in the developed world, an even greater interest, because this is one of those intergenerational issues. Our generation have used the antibiotics. And of course, Fleming prophesied that to a certain extent, the resistance, in his Nobel Prize. So how do we move forward? Our partners are, as always, Germany and Sweden, the Netherlands, but it has to move out of Northern Europe. And we wait to see what happens in the States. There's a lot of really good work on the ground and in Congress, but not at the moment the government leadership with the policies. But actually, their Health and Human Services have led quite a lot of initiatives globally on AMR. So they're there, they're doing some, but we think they can do more. But there are also, I'm like you, a glass half full person, as I said, signs of activity elsewhere. So in India, great that they have got a draft act of parliament to reduce effluent from their manufacturing. In China, getting rid of antibiotics is going to happen out of the food chain for prophylaxis and growth promotion. So bit by bit, people are moving forwards. I do think we need to work, because it covers everything. We call it One Health, but it's the food chain, it's our environment, it's human health, it's animal health. And as you know, I'm rather keen on fish farming. So I'm rather hopeful that we can get G20 back to discussing this and G7 taking action in order to spur other countries to come together. What will happen? Well, the UN does have a role to play. It's taken a long time to act on our recommendations from the Interagency Coordination Group. We're all waiting to see what the leaders group will how it will be constituted and what role they'll play, let alone the equivalent of the climate change evidence group. If they really play out strongly, we can make a difference using the UN as well. So fingers crossed. But you know, what we should never forget is that each of us has a role to play. We have a role to play as an individual, washing hands, being careful, a role to play as an individual, not asking for antibiotics or not demanding them when we're told they won't work, it's a virus, in stewardship, and roles to play both in our everyday work and as lobbyists for our own government for change and for taking this on board. So as we come to the end of this discussion, do you think COVID-19 will help us move AMR forwards, or is that on my part wishful thinking? Because I care, like you, we've both been kind of fighters for the AMR action, as it were. Do you think we can use COVID, and if so, how should we use it to get governments to move and innovate around AMR?
I believe that COVID-19 will actually help us, because COVID-19 was the pandemic. Everybody knew disease X was coming, but nobody knew what disease X would be. And we will have until January 10, when the genetic code of SARS-CoV-2 was published on the GSAID platform, an open access platform, nobody knew SARS-CoV-2, and therefore it's not surprising that it's surprising how fast we were able to respond thanks to a strong innovation ecosystem. But I now see a lot of people talking about future pandemic preparedness, and I see a lot of people agreeing that, oh, thanks God we had such a strong and important pharma industry, because with all due respect to the Master of Trinity College and all the academics, at the end of the day, the scalable solutions to COVID-19, treatments or vaccines, will be manufactured and will be developed by the folks in basically big pharma companies. That's why the collaboration between academia and big pharma, biotech and big pharma, is so important. I think COVID-19, in terms of we should be better prepared for the next pandemic, also gives us a chance to bring AMR higher up on the table. I've called AMR the silent killer, because you don't have a really patient group. I've recently had a discussion with Carrie Adams from the Union for International Cancer Control, and I was very pleased to see that they start talking about AMR and cancer care, very much along the lines you do, because you do have cancer patients dying from secondary infections and not from cancer. And I think if we really mobilize, and you mentioned the consumer, I also believe in the One Health approach. Therefore, I do believe that I'm extremely pleased to see how consumers want to know what they eat when they buy food, when they are in the restaurants. We should get, kind of coalition. I personally believe the coalition of the willing is likely to have a fast and bigger impact when it comes on the incentives. But I also agree that part of our Action Fund, and that's why we teamed up with the Wellcome Trust and the EIB and WHO early on, we do have public health provisions, we have a charter on access provisions, but at the same time, I'm extremely keen, it can't just be access, it needs to be access and stewardship. Because if whatever comes out of the research would be just shared without clear certified stewardship provisions, we might run into new resistance much faster. But I must say, I am an optimist, and I do believe that 2020 can be a game-changing year for the positive.
Thank you, Thomas. That's probably a very good point to finish on, the agreement together that we need scientists and industry. We all play different roles and they're all needed by society, and that this year could be an important year for AMR. So in fact, let me call on our audience. They, our audience, you, the audience, can make the difference. Join in and help us turn the tide on AMR. Thank you, Thomas. And I'm sorry you weren't in my study, or you would have been given a cup of coffee.
Thank you, Sally. Look forward to it.